The carriage stopped in the middle of the forest, miles from anywhere. Her stepmother didn't get down to say goodbye. She simply opened the door, told her to walk, and left her there as the sun went down and the temperature dropped and the trees closed in around her like something that had been waiting a very long time to be asked. She thought she was alone. She wasn't. Something with yellow eyes had been watching from the tree line since before the carriage ever arrived, and by the time the night was over, it had already decided she belonged to it. Ilara Vance had known for the better part of a year that her stepmother meant to be rid of her. She simply had not understood until the carriage rolled to a stop on a forest road that led to nowhere in particular exactly how far Marguerite Vance was prepared to accomplish it. Ilara's father, Thomas Vance, had been a modest landowner of good but unremarkable fortune, a man whose second marriage, 3 years after his first wife's death, had brought a woman of considerable beauty and considerably more ambition into a household that had, until then, belonged quietly and entirely to his only daughter. Marguerite had arrived at Ashwood House with a smile that promised warmth and a manner that delivered, in time, something else entirely. A slow, patient campaign to make Ilara feel in her own father's home exactly as unwelcome as a woman with Marguerite's particular talents could arrange without ever once raising her voice or showing her hand too plainly. The will, read a fortnight after the funeral, had left Ashwood House and the greater part of Thomas Vance's fortune in trust for Ilara to be released upon her marriage or her 25th birthday, whichever came first, with Marguerite granted only a modest widow's allowance and the right to remain in the house until that date arrived. It was, Ilara understood immediately upon hearing the terms read aloud, precisely the arrangement calculated to make her own continued existence the single greatest obstacle standing between Marguerite and the fortune she had clearly married Thomas Vance to eventually claim. Ilara did not know, in the months that followed, exactly what her stepmother intended. She knew only that the small cruelties grew sharper, that meals arrived late or not at all, that the household staff, one by one, found themselves dismissed and replaced with servants whose loyalty belonged entirely to Marguerite rather than to the house's rightful heir, and that she had begun, by early autumn, sleeping with her door barred and a kitchen knife kept beneath her pillow, a precaution she told herself was excessive, even as some quieter instinct insisted it was not nearly excessive enough. The morning the carriage came, Marguerite had told her with a warmth in her voice that had not touched her eyes in over a year, that a distant cousin in the north had written asking Ilara to visit, an invitation Marguerite insisted would do her considerable good after so difficult a season of grief. Ilara had not believed a word of it. She had climbed into the carriage anyway, because refusing outright would have given Marguerite an excuse to do something considerably more direct, and because some small stubborn part of her still hoped, against every accumulated instinct of the past 3 years, that she was wrong about what was actually being arranged. She was not wrong. The carriage traveled for the better part of a day, the roads growing narrower and rougher with each passing hour, until by late evening they had left anything resembling a proper road behind entirely. The wheels grinding over a forest track that seemed to Ilara's increasingly uneasy eye to lead considerably deeper into wilderness than any respectable cousin's estate could possibly require. The carriage stopped as the light began its first slow retreat toward evening. The driver, a man Ilara did not recognize among Marguerite's usual staff, opened the door and would not meet her eyes. "This is as far as I have been instructed to carry you, miss," he said. "There's no house here," Ilara said, looking out at nothing but trees stretching in every direction, the track itself already growing indistinct where it disappeared into deepening forest. "I've my instructions," the driver said, and would say no further, though something in his refusal to meet her gaze told her plainly that whatever those instructions were, he was not entirely comfortable carrying them.
Ilara stepped down because there was, in truth, no other choice available to her, and stood in the cooling autumn air, watching the carriage turn and rattle back the way it had come, the driver never once looking back until the sound of the wheels faded entirely into the forest's own gathering silence. She was alone, miles by her own estimation from any house, any village, any road that led anywhere a person might reasonably expect to find help before the cold and the dark closed in together. She understood, standing there as the light continued its slow retreat, exactly what her stepmother had arranged, and exactly what outcome Marguerite expected this particular abandonment to produce. She did not weep. She had promised herself somewhere in the 3 hard years since her stepmother's arrival that she would not give the woman the satisfaction of breaking her, even from a considerable distance, and she found, standing alone in a darkening forest with nothing but her clothes on her back and whatever courage she could summon against the coming night, that the promise held. She began walking in the direction she judged most likely to eventually find a road, because standing still accomplished nothing beyond hastening the cold's advantage, and because she had decided in that first steadying breath that she intended to survive this, whatever it eventually cost her. She did not yet know that she was already being watched. Duke Cassius Wraithmore lived at Ravensmark Hall on the northern edge of Hollow Forest for the whole of his 32 years, the last 4 of them alone since his own parents had left him the title, the estate, and a considerable weight of solitary responsibility he had learned slowly and with some difficulty to carry without complaint. He had also lived, for those same 4 years, with a considerably stranger inheritance than the title alone accounted for. A great gray wolf, easily twice the size of any ordinary forest wolf, who had appeared at Ravensmark's edge that same autumn his father died, and had remained since, not tamed exactly, never fully domesticated in any manner a proper household might have found comfortable, but bonded to Cassius himself with a loyalty that defied every ordinary explanation the local villagers or his own considerably skeptical staff had ever managed to construct. The wolf was called Fenrir, a name Cassius's late father had given him in the brief weeks before his death, and the creature ranged freely across Hollow Forest's considerable acreage, appearing and vanishing according to some private logic entirely its own, though it returned always, eventually, to Ravensmark's own grounds, where it slept most nights before the great hall's fire, like something that had decided long ago that this particular house and this particular man belonged to it as surely as it belonged to them. Fenrir had been ranging that particular autumn afternoon along the southern boundary of the forest, some considerable distance from Ravensmark itself, when the sound of carriage wheels, unfamiliar and considerably out of place on a track that led to nothing but wilderness, drew the great wolf's attention through the thickening trees. He watched from the deep cover of a holly thicket as the carriage stopped, as a young woman descended into the cooling afternoon air, as the driver spoke words the wolf could not understand, but whose particular cadence of guilt and discomfort registered in whatever manner a wolf's instincts process such things as something considerably wrong with the whole proceeding. He watched the carriage depart, leaving the woman entirely alone as the light began its long retreat toward evening. Fenrir did not approach immediately. He had learned across 4 years of careful observation that humans startled easily, and that trust, where it existed at all between his kind and hers, needed to be earned through patience rather than presumption. He simply followed at a careful distance through the trees, tracking her slow, uncertain progress as she walked in what he understood through instincts considerably sharper than any human tracker's eye, to be entirely the wrong direction for finding help before nightfall. She walked for the better part of 2 hours before the light failed entirely, and Fenrir watched her movements grow increasingly labored, her steps increasingly uncertain in the gathering dark, until she finally stopped beside the broad trunk of an ancient oak, exhaustion and cold having caught up with her considerably faster than her own stubborn will could outpace them. She sat with her back against the trunk, drawing her knees up against her chest, and Fenrir watched her shoulders shake once with something she fought visibly to control, before her breathing steadied again into the careful, deliberate rhythm of a person determined not to weep. He made his decision then, the way wolves make decisions, not through any process a human philosopher would readily recognize as reasoning, but some older, surer instinct that had, across 4 years at Ravensmark, learned to recognize the particular quality of a creature worth protecting. He stepped from the tree line. Elara heard the movement before she saw it, her whole body going rigid with a fear that arrived in that first terrible instant, considerably sharper than the cold or the exhaustion combined. She looked up to find 2 yellow eyes catching what little moonlight had begun to filter through the canopy, a shape considerably larger than any ordinary forest predator emerging slowly from the darkness between the trees.
She did not run. She understood, with the particular clarity that arrives sometimes in genuine extremity, that running would accomplish nothing against a creature that size, beyond hastening whatever outcome it intended, and she found herself instead going very still, her breath held, watching the great wolf approach with a caution that mirrored, though she could not have known it, the creature's own careful, deliberate patience. Fenrir stopped some several feet distant, close enough that she could see, in the pale moonlight, the considerable size and evident strength of him, but far enough that he did not yet crowd whatever fragile courage she had managed to assemble. He lay down. It was not the action of a predator preparing to strike. It was the deliberate, unhurried gesture of something settling in to keep watch. And Elara, watching this considerably confusing behavior unfold before her exhausted, disbelieving eyes, found herself understanding, slowly and with a wonder that momentarily overcame even her exhaustion, that the creature had not come to harm her at all. "You're not going to hurt me," she said aloud, mostly to steady her own racing heart rather than any expectation that the wolf might somehow answer. Fenrir's ears shifted at the sound of her voice, and he made no move to rise, no move to close the remaining distance between them, simply continuing to watch her with the same patient, unhurried attention he had maintained since first stepping from the trees. "I don't understand you," Alara said, "but I think perhaps I'm considerably less alone in this forest than I believed a moment ago." She did not sleep that first night, not properly, though exhaustion pulled at her considerably as the hours wore on. She simply sat with her back against the ancient oak, watching the great wolf who had settled a short distance away, watching her in turn, and found somewhere in the strange, wordless companionship of that long, cold night a measure of courage she had not expected the forest to offer her. Dawn arrived, gray and cold, mist curling low between the trees, and Ilara awoke from the shallow, uneasy rest she had eventually surrendered to find the great wolf still there, seated now rather than lying, watching her with the same patient attention that had carried them both through the long night. "You stayed," she said, her voice rough with cold and disuse. Fenrir rose and took several careful steps toward her, close enough now that she could see in the pale morning light the considerable intelligence in his yellow eyes, an intelligence that unsettled her considerably less than she might have expected, given everything else this terrible day and night had already required of her nerve. He turned after a moment's careful study of her face and took several steps in a direction she had not yet considered walking, then stopped and looked back at her, the particular unmistakable posture of a creature waiting to see whether she understood the invitation. "You want me to follow you," Ilara said slowly. Fenrir's ears shifted forward, and he took several more steps in the same direction before pausing again to look back. Ilara considered for a long moment the accumulated evidence of the past night, a creature that had watched rather than attacked, that had settled to guard rather than to hunt, that had remained through the whole cold darkness rather than abandoning her to whatever ordinary forest dangers a lone woman might otherwise have faced. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has run entirely out of better options, that she had very little to lose by trusting an instinct that had, so far, proven considerably kinder than her own stepmother's calculated cruelty. "Very well," she said, pushing herself upright on legs stiff with cold and long stillness. "Lead on, then, whoever you are." They walked for the better part of 2 hours, Fenrir maintaining a pace careful enough that Ilara's exhausted, stumbling steps could keep him in sight, pausing whenever she fell too far behind to allow her to catch her breath before continuing, until the trees began gradually to thin, and Ilara found herself looking out across a final rise at the distant gray towers of a considerable manor house, smoke rising steady from several of its chimneys against the pale morning sky. "Is that where you're taking me?" she said, and Fenrir, as though understanding the question in whatever manner his considerable intelligence allowed, made a low sound in his throat that was not quite a growl and not quite anything else Ilara could properly name, before continuing forward down the rise toward the distant house. "I need you to stay with me here for a moment, because what waited inside that house was about to change everything Ilara thought she understood about the night she'd just survived. And I promise you, the answer to who actually lived there and why his wolf had chosen to save a stranger's life was considerably stranger than either of them expected." Cassius Wraithmore had spent that particular morning in his study,
working through a state correspondence with the distracted attention of a man who had, for the better part of the previous evening, found himself uncharacteristically restless. Some instinct he could not properly name, suggesting that Fenrir's absence, longer than the wolf's usual ranging typically required, carried some significance he did not yet understand. He heard the commotion from the front hall before his steward, a careful and long-serving man named Aldrich Penhallow, appeared in the study doorway with an expression Cassius had rarely seen on the man's usually composed features. "Your Grace," Penhallow said, "there is a young woman at the door. She arrived with Fenrir. She appears to have spent the night in the forest." Cassius rose immediately, crossing to the entrance hall to find Ilara standing just inside the great doors, her clothes torn and mud-stained from the long night's ordeal, her face pale with exhaustion and cold, but her posture, he noted immediately, carrying a considerable and unmistakable dignity, despite everything the forest had clearly put her through. Fenrir sat beside her, close enough that his flank pressed against her leg, an intimacy the great wolf had never, in Cassius's own 4 years of careful observation, extended to any other soul beyond Cassius himself. "You'll forgive my appearance, Your Grace," Fenrir said, her voice steady, despite the evident it cost her to keep it so. "I confess I did not expect to arrive at any respectable household in quite this condition." "You'll forgive my asking plainly, but how did you come to be alone in Hollow Forest, and how did you come to arrive here in the company of my wolf?" Ilara told him, standing there in the cold entrance hall with Fenrir's warm bulk steady against her leg, the whole of what had brought her to this point. Her stepmother's carefully calculated cruelty, the carriage that had abandoned her miles from any proper road, the long cold night she had survived only because a creature with no obligation whatsoever to her safety had chosen, for reasons neither of them could properly explain, to keep watch over her until morning. Cassius listened with a growing stillness that Ilara, watching his composed face carefully, understood to be the particular quality of a man controlling considerable anger rather than failing to feel it. "Your stepmother left you to die, believing the forest itself would accomplish what she was unwilling to arrange more directly." "That was, I believe, precisely her intention," Ilara said. "Then she has made a very grave miscalculation," Cassius said, "because Fenrir does not extend his protection lightly. Miss—" "Ilara," said Ilara. "Ilara Vance." "Miss Vance," Cassius said, "and I find myself considerably inclined to ensure that whatever protection he's already chosen to extend you continues, for as long as you require it, under this roof." Fenrir, as though understanding the exchange far better than any ordinary creature reasonably should, pressed closer against Ilara's leg and made again that low, considering sound that was not quite a growl, and Ilara found herself standing in the entrance hall of a house she had not known existed a day before, surrounded by a duke's careful courtesy and a wolf's inexplicable devotion, feeling for the first time in longer than she could properly remember something that resembled, however cautiously, safety. "I should tell you plainly, Your Grace," she said, "that my stepmother believes me dead, or very shortly to become so. I do not know what she intends should she discover otherwise." "Then we shall need to discover, considerably more carefully than she did, exactly what she intends before we decide what to do about it."
Ilara remained at Ravensmark Hall through the following days, recovering slowly from the ordeal of that long, cold night, tended by a housekeeper named Mrs. Aldwych, whose careful, unfussy kindness reminded Ilara considerably of a warmth she had not experienced in her own household since her father's death. Fenrir remained close throughout, rarely leaving her side except when some private forest errand called him briefly away, always returning within the hour to resume his careful, watchful post. And Cassius, observing this continued devotion with a scholar's genuine curiosity, found himself increasingly convinced that the wolf's attachment carried some significance considerably beyond simple chance. "He's never behaved this way toward anyone else," Cassius admitted, one quiet evening, the two of them seated before the great hall's fire, while Fenrir dozed, his great head resting across Ilara's feet with a proprietary comfort that suggested he considered the arrangement entirely settled. "Perhaps," Ilara said carefully, "he simply recognized someone who needed protecting and decided, in whatever manner wolves decide such things, that he was equal to the task." "Perhaps," Cassius agreed, though something in his thoughtful expression suggested the truth carried rather more weight than simple chance allowed.
It was Penhallow, some days later, working through the estate's own considerable library in search of some entirely unrelated record, who came across an old account recorded in Cassius's own late father's careful hand, describing the peculiar circumstances of Fenrir's original arrival at Ravensmark. A description that mentioned, in passing, a local legend concerning wolves of unusual size and unusual intelligence, said to inhabit Hollow Forest's oldest, deepest reaches, creatures the old stories claimed were drawn, generation after generation, to protect those who arrived in the forest through genuine injustice rather than simple misfortune. My father believed the old stories more than he ever properly admitted, Cassius said, reading Penhallow's discovery with a growing fascination he had not expected the dusty old account to produce. He wrote here that Fenrir arrived the same week he himself received word of a considerable injustice done to a tenant family on the estate's southern boundary, a family he'd only just resolved to properly assist. He seemed to believe the timing was no coincidence. "You believe Fenrir arrived to protect your father in some similar manner," Ilara said. "I believe," Cassius said slowly, "that whatever drew Fenrir to my father's side 4 years ago may be precisely what drew him to your side in that forest, Miss Vance. I do not entirely understand it. I find I've stopped these past several days, particularly troubling myself to try." Ilara considered this, watching the great wolf sleep peacefully across her feet, his considerable warmth, a comfort she had not expected any creature, human or otherwise, to provide her so completely after everything her own family had proven itself capable of. "Then perhaps," she said quietly, "the injustice he recognized in me was considerably plainer than either of us has yet properly examined. My stepmother did not simply abandon me to misfortune. She arranged, quite deliberately, for me to die so that she might claim an inheritance that was never rightfully hers to take." "Then we shall need," Cassius said, his composed voice carrying a new and considerable resolve, "to ensure that injustice is answered properly rather than simply survived." Word, they both understood, would eventually need to reach Ashwood House, confirming Ilara's survival and setting in motion whatever legal reckoning her stepmother's actions genuinely deserved.
But Cassius, considering the matter carefully across several long evenings of discussion, counseled patience before any such word was sent. "Your stepmother believes you dead," he said. "That belief, however monstrous its origin, currently protects you from whatever further action she might otherwise attempt, should she learn you survived and understand her scheme discovered. I would have us gather first whatever evidence exists of her original scheme against you before we reveal our hand and give her opportunity to construct some more careful defense against the accusation." Ilara, understanding the wisdom in this caution, even as every instinct urged her toward immediate confrontation, agreed to the delay, and spent the following weeks at Ravensmark recovering her strength, learning the considerable rhythms of the estate under Cassius's increasingly attentive care, and finding in the quiet companionship that grew steadily between them across shared evenings by the great hall's fire something she had not expected the whole terrible business of her survival to eventually produce. "I confess," Cassius admitted, one particular evening, as autumn's chill deepened toward the year's first frost, "that I find myself considerably reluctant for this arrangement's necessary conclusion. Once your stepmother's scheme is properly answered, and your own fortune and safety properly secured, you'll have very little reason remaining to stay at Ravensmark." "Perhaps," Ilara said, something warm and careful entering her own voice, "I might find reason enough regardless, Your Grace, should the right invitation eventually be extended." Fenrir, dozing before the fire between them, shifted at the sound of their voices and settled again with a low, contented sound that seemed to both of them considerably more like satisfaction than mere chance. But the following morning brought word, carried by a rider Cassius's own steward had dispatched some weeks before to quietly observe Ashwood House's affairs, that Margaretta Vance had grown considerably bold in her presumed widowhood's aftermath, and had begun, in the weeks since Ilara's presumed death, quietly arranging the sale of considerable portions of the Vance estate's most valuable holdings, moving with a haste that suggested she intended to convert as much of the fortune as possible into ready coin before any legal challenge to her authority could properly be raised. "She's stealing what remains before anyone can stop her," Ilara said, reading the rider's careful report with a cold, steady anger that had replaced, somewhere across these recovering weeks, the raw fear of that first terrible night. "Then we've very little time remaining," Cassius said, "before whatever evidence exists of her original scheme against you disappears along with the fortune she means to steal." Fenrir rose from his place before the fire and moved to stand beside Ilara with a stillness that carried unmistakably the same watchful readiness he first shown her in that cold forest clearing, as though he understood, in whatever manner his considerable intelligence allowed, that the true reckoning was only just beginning. Ilara looked down at the great wolf who had saved her life, and up at the Duke who had in the weeks since offered her considerably more than simple shelter, and understood, standing there in the gathering urgency of that cold morning, that the next confrontation would require every scrap of courage the forest had first taught her she possessed. "Then we go to Ashwood House, and we finish what my stepmother started, on our own terms rather than hers." Ilara Vance survived the night her stepmother meant to kill her. She found shelter and safety and something that might, given time, become considerably more than either. But Margareta Vance does not yet know her stepdaughter is alive, and what Ilara, Cassius, and Fenrir find waiting for them at Ashwood House will test every ounce of courage this forest has already taught her to carry. If you want to know whether Ilara reclaims what's rightfully hers, whether Margareta finally answers for what she's done, and whether Fenrir's protection is enough to see them all through what comes next, comment Part 2 below and tell us where you're watching from. If enough of you want it, we'll take you to Ashwood House ourselves. The next part is already waiting to be told.